Thank you very much, Golly. And I'm going to mostly do the asking of the questions as I get to play reporter. I work for Hearst, not Hertz, which is a frequent question our CEO gets, not the rental car company, but the media company. So I'll try to role model excellent reporting skills right now. But we're delighted to be here. I know Joshua and I are excited for this conversation, and it's, as always, wonderful to see such an amazing group of talented leaders and people, knowing the Jewish community from all walks of my personal life. So it's really fun to see so many familiar faces. Joshua, thanks for taking the time. I'm glad to see the Israeli flag still front and center behind your head from the last time we spoke, now more than ever, I suspect. So diving in, what Daryl kind of stole my thunder a little bit in the beginning, but when we last talked, you had that an analogy for times of change I thought was great. If I'm someone on this call, I might say there's so much going on in the Jewish community right now. There's so many demands for thinking, for leadership. Is this really the right time to be thinking about talent? Is this really the right time to be thinking about any other change on top of what we're already facing? I know you've had some experiences thinking about how to affect change in systems and organizations. How do you respond to that kind of question?
Thanks so much, Rachel. It is a little eerie to be on the receiving side of questions. I'm much more comfortable asking students questions, but I have to say,
take your own medicine.
Hey, and Gali, your introduction, this is the conversation, the work that Leading Edge is doing on the talent pipeline is something that I've been waiting for about 25 years. That when I first started to serve in various capacities in the local Jewish community, I would always ask, probably be annoying, asking folks, well, how about talent? How about talent? How about the people who are actually delivering all of the things that we want our Jewish organizations to deliver? The analogy I would use is one that, to answer your question, Rachel, is the analogy that my dissertation advisor always used. The late J. Richard Hackman, who was an expert on all kinds of organizations, and in particular on teams, everything from product development teams to symphony orchestras to string quartets to intelligence teams, military intelligence teams. He studied every imaginable team within broader organizations. And he would always say, and what he taught all of us, was the best time to effect change is when the billiard balls are all in motion. That most systems are fairly static, and that if you try to move one thing at a time, it just gravitationally pulls everything back into place. And that counterintuitively, it's when all of the balls are moving around that you have the greatest likelihood of effecting deep and enduring change. And so one way that I look at what's going on now, both broadly, if you think about post-pandemic, what's happening in the global economy, what's happening in a polarized world, as well as more proximately for the Jewish community, if we think about what happened last year with the judicial overhaul or reform, depending on which side of the political aisle you sit on, you would call it something different, and how that elicited reactions to Israel, certainly since October 7th, now with what we're seeing on campuses, and how Jewish communities are simultaneously rallying and healing and supporting Israel. I think this is a moment when a lot of those billiard balls are in motion, and as challenging as it is for everyone on this Zoom and everyone inside Jewish organizations to manage all of that change in the larger context, it's in fact an ideal opportunity to think from kind of the studs up about the future and how we want to arrange things in order to build the sort of talent pipeline that is equipped, that is motivated, that's coordinated amongst themselves to deliver for the Jewish community of the future. The last piece of this for me is that there's the famous saying that generals always fight the last war. And that's actually true of all human beings. We are much better solving the challenge we just came through. And the real deeper challenge, I think, for Jews and the Jewish people is we really can't afford to make that mistake. We are too small, we are too vulnerable just because of our numbers, even though we are a strong community internally, that we really have to be forward thinking both in the way we develop our talent and in what we ask our talent to take on. And so now at this moment, when so much is in flux, this is an ideal time to think in fresh ways about developing the talent who will lead our people in the future.
Yeah, the billiard ball analogy I thought was so true. And I imagine at this point we feel like the balls have flown off the table, but still we can get them back on and go where they need to go. I mean, we've made the assumption that talent is one of those important components, but I know in your work you study a lot of what makes successful organizations and successful leaders. Could you talk a little bit about what role talent does play? Like if you think about a broader organization, or if we take a step back and think about the Jewish professional community as a system, how do you think about the various components, and how important is it that we get the talent right versus other investments we could be making?
Sure. And you've obviously, I get to study it and teach about it. You've lived through it and you've led through it.
Well, you've lived through it too. I can't imagine this moment it's very easy to manage the talent of a professorship or a professor body. So
Well,
you're living it also.
right. Well, and everybody's getting a front row seat now based on
Exactly.
what's going on campuses. So I would take a step back and often and just talk about the word leadership. Oftentimes when people think about leadership, they think it's a mystical quality. They imagine that smoke is going to come up from the ground. And people also get nervous because they wonder, like, do I have the genetic makeup to be a leader? Like, do I have the right traits to be a leader? And at Harvard Business School, the bias we have is that leadership is a form of work. It's a form of work. And then what each individual has to do is figure out how they can bring the best version of themselves to that work. And so that work is all about ensuring that the performing unit that you are responsible for. Performing unit is just kind of a pedantic word to capture whether it's a team, whether it is a business unit, whether it is a school, whether it's an entire organization, that the work of leadership is to ensure that that performing unit can in fact deliver. And what that means is that you as a leader, the work you have to do is serve as a beacon. We are fond of lighthouses in New England. A beacon, meaning you are shedding light on the context and you are illuminating a path forward. And as an architect, the person who puts in place the set of conditions and practices that will ensure that the organization can pursue that direction that you've illuminated through the waters that you have to navigate, that you can pursue that direction to create value. So beacon, illuminating the context, figuring out the waters in which you need to navigate, and then illuminating a direction through it. Architect, putting in place the set of practices and conditions that will ensure that the performing unit, team, entire organization can in fact deliver. So where does talent come in? It's one of the crucial tools that you have as an architect to ensure that your organization can deliver, to ensure that it can pursue the direction to create value. And there are two levels here, right? That you as a leader need to have that talent to be able to articulate a direction given the context you're facing, and use the tools in order to create the conditions and practices to pursue the direction in a manner that will create value. And right, your talent, the talent that you have, is part of the architecture, part of the organizational design that will ensure that you can convert the direction into the value you seek to create, whether it's educating our youth, whether it's providing direct human services to those in need, whether it's supporting various organizations in Israel or in the former Soviet Union. Whatever the mandate of a given organization, your own talent as a leader and the talent in your organization is going to determine and is going to be one of the crucial tools that you have to drive the direction of the organization and create value. But it's part of a larger system. It's part of that larger system for which you're responsible as a leader.
And I think you talk about, three of these tools. I think you say like people, culture, and then the systems. when you say there's a difference between people and culture, how would you articulate that? Because I think sometimes we conflate those two things, but I guess some are the pieces you have in the system, and then the culture might be like the norms in which they operate, or the system in which they operate. But how do you talk about that in the classroom?
Sure. So when we think about, right, the leader as beacon sets the direction, the leader as architect has a set of tools. What are the tools, as you indicated, Rachel? The tools
I'm
are
a good student. I listened,
right. Yeah,
Joshua, when you
the
taught me
tools are
last time.
three. The tools are three. The first, the people in the organization, and by people we mean what are the common attitudes, the common skills, the common experiences we want everyone in the organization to have. And then we have to think about the workforce as a whole. When we think about the people, what are the dimensions of difference, the dimensions of diversity that we want to make sure our workforce as a whole encompasses? That's the people. Then we've got the culture. I like to joke, culture is the word we use when we can't explain something. We just blame it on the culture. It must be the culture. And we have difficulty defining culture. I'll give you two ways. There are two ways I like, two shorthand for defining culture. One is what you said, norms. Norms are simply implicit rules. Rules that aren't written down, aren't explicitly stated, but everyone knows they govern how we function around here. And then the second way to think about culture is in terms of reflexes. What are our behavioral reflexes when we face two types of challenge? One is how we coordinate across our different parts, across different personalities, across different functional areas, across different regions and geographies. What are our behavioral reflexes for coordinating internally and integrating? And second, what are our behavioral reflexes when we need to adapt, when there's either an incremental change we need to make because something has happened in our external environment, we have fewer resources, we suddenly have a loss of talent, or when there's a major perturbation. COVID hits, now we have to go remote, October 7th hits. So you can think of culture as what are our reflexes when we need to coordinate internally across our differences, or when we need to adapt to something that's happened from the outside. So we've got the people, we've got the culture, and now systems are all of the different sets of practices that are established. We have our resource allocation systems and our budget systems. We've got our information technology systems, our product development systems. And you can say, well, product development, curriculum development for schools, programming development if you're at any other sort of an organization, and of course, talent management systems, how we recruit people, how we hire people, how we develop them, how we evaluate them, and then how we compensate them, all part of a talent management system. Finally, structure, systems and structure go together. Structure, how are we organized? Hierarchically, is it more distributed? And who has decision rights? Where do decision rights around different things reside in the organization? So our people, different from our culture, and the systems and the structure are designed to ensure that we get the mix of people that we need, and that we have the culture that we need, and we're fostering the culture that we need in order to create value, in order to deliver on our direction to create value. So yes, so you as a leader, and what we need our leaders in the Jewish community to do is to really think about those internal guts, those internal tools. What's the culture I want to foster? What are the sorts of people we need to have here, and what are the dimensions of diversity? And then what are the systems? How do I want to set up the systems, or how do I want to tweak the systems? And how do I want to set up the structure or adapt the structure in order to support the culture, in order also to recruit and retain the best people in order to deliver on our direction?
I love that. I love that description of culture as behavioral reflexes, actually, because I think that's a word we do struggle with. And that captures it perfectly, right? How, when there's no rule book, how are you acting? What's your first reaction? And I think that's actually a really insightful description. All right, so we've established it as a leader, you kind of have some tools at your disposal: people, talent, systems, and structure. If we were to double click on people and talent, or people, culture, system, structure, if we're going to double click on people and culture and say specifically to the Jewish community, right? We have leaders out there who are trying to be beacons. And as they have these tools, what is a unique constraints, or what are some things you've observed that is either, I guess, positive or negative, that is different for leaders in the Jewish community vis-a-vis their talent versus outside?
Sure. So these are a set of observations that I have about our community. First, I think we've been quite and understandably preoccupied with affordability. So we need our talent to really have its eye on the affordability, whether coming out of Passover, we can think about the affordability of food, but we can think about the affordability of synagogue membership, of going, of being, of educational opportunities, of summer experiences. We've been really focused on affordability. I'm not sure we paid equal attention to the affordability of those who supply those experiences, the affordability of choosing a career in the Jewish community. And if we're going to attract the very best talent to Jewish organizations, we have to start to think about, are we making it affordable for the best talent to come into our communal organizations to serve the Jewish community? And we haven't focused enough on that, I don't think. And some of that, I hate to say, is a bit of a legacy mentality that our Jewish staff members, it's the folks who staff all of our Jewish organizations, are hired help. They sort of, they should be fortunate to have this job, and anyone can call the shots. And are they really professional? And we haven't yet caught up with the view that these are serious professionals equipped to do their best for the community. They should enjoy a professional environment, professional treatment, and they should be equipped to be able to deliver at the highest level. And we need to think about creating lives for them that are thriving, that are affordable, so that the Jewish community becomes a magnet for the very best talent, rather than kind of folks feeling as though they're burdened or they're making sacrifices in order to join the sorts of organizations that all of you help fund.
Well, at the risk of alienating people on this call, so just to press on that a little bit, right? So I hear the first point, which is largely a compensation point, right? Are we paying enough? Like, we're so worried with keeping the cost low of the products we're offering that's resulted in us arguably underpaying or at least paying below market the people who actually create those. But I hear you saying something different, which is something in addition, which is something around the autonomy or prestige associated with the roles. Can you say a little bit more about that, just to help me understand what you've observed that's different in the Jewish community versus the potentially the private sector?
Let me share two different angles on this, Rachel, if I can, and I'd love to hear your perspective, having been at McKinsey and now at Hearst, and also actively involved in Jewish organizations. So I would put it two ways. One, and I'm sorry to poke the eye of folks. Some folks may feel that I'm poking you in the eye on this call.
I led you there. They can blame me.
No, that's okay. I think that there is a tendency in the Jewish community to think we should always build our own. We know how to build our own. We should build our own training programs. We should build our own immersion experiences. And we kind of ignore that there are great organizations out there who are already training the very best professionals to enter all kinds,
including Harvard Business School,
including my institution, including lots of other institutions that are right now in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. But there are advantages if we in fact send our talent from the Jewish community to these organizations, to these programs. And that is, right, they're getting the type of training that leaders across multiple sectors in industry are getting, and they're shoulder to shoulder with those folks, learning from them. Obviously, there's a time and place for us to create the customized types of developmental experiences that people in the Jewish community need. I'm just not sure that's as necessary as the number of programs that we create on our own would lead us to believe, and that we may want to avail ourselves more of existing opportunities and sending our people to those so that they can learn not just from the very best institutions, but from the other people that those institutions attract, and then expand their base of experience. The second is one of the things I'll just tie to what is really keeping me up at night now, which is as you think about what does it take to run a university? Okay, and the reason I'm raising this is because this is what it also, hopefully not in as much complexity, takes to run a Jewish organization. And really organizations, the sort of the pointy-headed academic term is institutional pluralism. But the idea is that an organization is three different things. First of all, it is a practical tool or instrument. What does that mean? It has to get a set of tasks done, right? It has to educate children. It has to deliver services. It has to provide spiritual renewal, whatever its tasks are. That's one thing that an organization is. But it's not just that. An organization is also a venue of human living, or you can think, I like the analogy of it's an arboretum where people derive meaning from what they're doing and how they're treated, and they foster meaning for others, and they foster value for others in how they treat others. So yes, it's a practical instrument. It's also a venue of human living where people are making meaning and making value of what they happen to be working on and how they're interacting with others. And then third, they are investment vehicles. Organizations are also investment vehicles. Now, the obvious thing is vehicles of monetary investment. But that's not all that they are in terms of investment vehicles. People are investing commitment and time and effort and trust and faith in organizations. Now, an organization is all three of those things, and our leaders need to be able to, in fact, manage and lead all three of those things that a single organization is. And so when I think about Jewish organizations are all three of those things always. And to make it complicated, on that third one, there rarely is agreement from all of those who are investing monetary resources, time, effort, energy, faith, commitment in organizations. There's rarely agreement on what the priorities should be. So you, as a leader, need to ensure that you bring those parties together around a common vision, a common direction, even as you're ensuring that we're actually delivering on its role as a practical instrument to get those tasks done, even as you're creating an environment of human endeavor where people are making meaning and people are interacting with one another. And so when we come back to the Jewish community, are we making sure that our talent and the people that we're developing are able to do all three of those things? And that, even though it's now in the headlines as you see university presidents wrestle with all three of those, in fact, that has been the reality of Jewish organizations from their founding. And so we've got to be really clear on developing people for that role.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually interesting, Joshua. So you're essentially saying, I think, that would you say in a typical private sector role, their leaders are primarily focused on the first,
on the
right?
practical instrument, get it done, right?
Sell the make the widget, sell the widget, right? So what you're saying essentially is that, historically we've potentially been worried about the affordability of our product, hiring people who are putting out the product, but actually also doing a much more complex task. So it's an interesting way of reframing the talent in the Jewish world, where we're asking them to do a lot with relatively little resources, but on top of that, they're doing more than we would expect a similarly placed leader in the private sector. So it's actually more demanding of our talent.
We're more demanding, and we tend to have been focused on the affordability of their outputs and not, we're asking people to do three roles, not just one. And we haven't been thinking all that much about how we equip them for those three and how we make it an affordable life for them, given how much more it asks of them. But I'm going to bounce the question back to you as you think about your work in the Jewish community relative to your work in the private sector. What would you identify as the most significant and important differences as we look
Well,
ahead.
I like what you just raised. And by the way, I always interrupt, and I've read that there's a Jewish tendency towards what's called collaborative overlap. So I like to think that I'm collaboratively overlapping with you and not interrupting you. But I like where you've headed, and I hadn't thought about that. I mean, the one piece you haven't mentioned, which I've observed, and my experience is relatively light, obviously compared to everyone on this call, but it's the role of the board. So I've seen some instances, some organizations where the board role feels right. It feels like it is supporting, supplementing, providing needed guidance for the leadership of the organization. But I've seen other organizations where the board is quite stifling. And I think, I look at someone on this call is from my synagogue, so I hope this stays, we didn't say there's Chatham House rules, which I've heard everyone say a million times, but I hope there's Chatham House rules here. But, I look at the executive director of my synagogue and I think to myself, why did she do this? I mean, she is just getting stepped on by the board every left, right, and center, right? So now in private companies, you obviously everyone has a boss, right? I mean, even if you're the CEO of the company, you still have a boss. But, from my observation, the board role within the Jewish community is in many cases of a heightened involvement level, which I just think adds complexity and potentially, to your point earlier around this sense of prestige and autonomy, can undermine that feeling, right? If you're a chief executive or a leader of an organization, but it's the board that's out there, leading the meetings, getting the airtime, stifling your innovation, it probably doesn't feel that great. So I think that's the only piece I would add to what you just said. I don't know if that resonates with you.
We have this weird dysfunction in the Jewish community that everything people would never do in their professional lives, they feel licensed to do when they join a board. Now, obviously, I'm saying that in a broad manner, and I do think that at least my sense is that being really clear that that a board is not management, it's not responsible for operations, and at the same time, that goes hand in hand with advice and scrutiny, that
Exactly.
the management team should surface what it's working on to the board for them to scrutinize, question, advise, with the clear understanding that scrutinize, question, advise do not mean run, or step, steer. It means truly that kind of give and take is absolutely essential. And just tying back to your point, Rachel, we've got to equip both sides, both board members and the professional staff, the professional leaders of our organizations, really from the start of their careers to be able to handle that kind of work, right? The work that really, because that comes with commitment, that comes with people's trust in the organization. They want to be involved. We want to be able to equip our young talent to be able to manage that along with those three different functions of the organization.
Yeah. And Golly would want me to note that Daryl is perfect in every way. So that was no comment about Daryl. Yes, there you go. So if I were to summarize then what you just said, if we take a step back, we say, all right, talent is clearly, people and culture are clearly two of the biggest inputs we have into creating this future. As leaders, we have an interest in making sure that our talent is the right talent, is well equipped to meet the challenges at hand. And as we think about the ways the Jewish community is potentially challenged in that sense, one is, potentially compensation needs to be considered. Two is, are we supporting people for this three-headed role versus just the single role? And then three, are we thinking about the right role of the boards versus the leadership, and are we working towards really productive partnerships there? So I think those are all three things we can think about. I want to be sensitive to time. I promised to wrap up at the quarter of, but one last question I think is interesting, Joshua. As this talent collaborative has gotten underway, I think one thing we're struggling with, and I will defer to the folks on the call to make comments and afterwards if that's true or not. But I think one thing we're struggling with is, do we do a bunch of small little things? Do we do one big thing? And I know you've done in your research, you've been thinking about organizations that institute change, where big bets make sense versus where experiments or minimum viable products make sense. So any advice for this group, as we try to think about how we really energize the talent that's coming into and supported within the Jewish community, how would you advise we weigh those two options?
Sure. So I'm going to go backwards for 30 seconds and then take up the big bets versus experiments question that you just asked. I'd add a fourth item. And the fourth item to like, what do we need to have our eye on in terms of talent is developing people, managers who can develop other people in organizations. I think we tend to focus on the people who can create great content, the people who are great at reaching out to constituencies. We don't focus enough on how do we develop our people to be great developers of people. They can learn a lot going to programs, reading, going online, but the main place you learn is from the people who are mentoring you when you are on the job. So having our eye on how do we develop our people to be great developers of others and fostering the right sort of culture is as important as anything we invest directly in creating programs for rising talent. In terms of big bets versus experiments, there seems to be now, especially in the nonprofit world, largely, I think, thanks to the great work that the Bridgespan Group has done, a real focus on big bets. But we also have to ask ourselves, where do ideas for big bets come from? So it's this symbiotic relationship between big bets and experiments. And I think that all organizations, Jewish organizations are no exception, want experiments in name, but not in reality, because they want all their experiments to work. Lo and behold, they're going to be the lucky one who runs 100 experiments and 99 of them turn out. Well, the reality is that Jewish organizations are going to be no exception. We're going to have experiments that don't work. We're also going to have experiments that don't work, but from which we nonetheless learn. That's the whole point of an experiment. We run it because we're testing some sort of a hypothesis. And even if it doesn't work, we derive some lessons that allow us to try something again. And then we're going to get closer and closer to the areas where we can place some pretty big bets with reasonable assurance that it'll pay off. Maybe not in exactly the way we thought, but it will pay off with some high yield in terms of its impact. So I would just encourage folks that every time you hear about big bets and how might we place big bets, that your mind should automatically say, okay, and what are the set of experiments we're running? And what's our tolerance for failure? And what's our methodology for learning from failure? Because we need a culture in which we experiment. We are willing to let things not work out, and we've got a method, a system in place for learning so that we can take whatever we learn from a failure and build the next experiment. And by the way, and here I'm quoting my colleague Mitch Weiss, who was the former chief of staff to Mayor Menino here in Boston. I highly recommend Mitch's book. He talks about innovation in the public sector, directly relevant to nonprofits. But he makes a point painfully clear. Experiments and prototypes are not pilot programs. Pilot programs are microcosms of the thing you're going to run on bigger scale. Experiments and prototypes are designed to test a hypothesis you have about how something might work. And all you're looking for is data that, oh yeah, this worked or it didn't work. This is how we need to shift a little bit. So in answer to your question, Rachel, I think we need both.
Yes,
We've gravitated towards like a big bets mentality. And I think the folks on this call can help create an environment in which we're more willing to truly experiment, knowing that we celebrate failures. We celebrate failures. Corning Glass Company, the folks who bring you the glass on this device, the folks who bring you the glass through which your COVID vaccine is administered. Corning Glass has a celebration every year with a birthday cake to celebrate all of their failures. Okay, and so we need to create that kind of environment and those sorts of resources. And it's tough because like we're spending resources, something doesn't work. It's painful. We get that, but there's no other way we're going to get the things that work unless we try a whole bunch of stuff, fail, and learn from those failures.
Yeah, and I think Joe's point in the comments is the right one, that as a united group, we can do a lot more experiments than maybe any one of us could. So I love that comment. Joshua, thank you so much. I feel like we'd already had a version of this conversation in prep, but I've already written down a whole bunch of new notes. So thank you for the insights and for translating what you study in an academic setting so well into this real world. And thank you for taking the time, especially at, I know it is a crazy time on campus. We appreciate it.